It's the week ending Saturday the 29th of January, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the US rejecting Russian demands to bar Ukraine from NATO, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange winning his right to appeal against extradition to America, and the death of comedy great Barry Cryer at the age of 86. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from The Week magazine is editor Theo Tait. We welcome back the assistant editor at Goal, Emma Smith, and from the daily history podcast The Retrospectors, it's the man with 2 children, Arion McNicoll. Congratulations on the baby, Arion.
Thank you. That's a headline that's gone under the radar that certainly has repercussions for all of my life.
How are you sleeping?
Been worse. Last night wasn't too bad, but if I fall asleep halfway through this recording and stop replying, you'll understand what's happened.
Okay, we can judge your contribution accordingly. Okay, Theo, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
It was a week when we were given a very disturbing look behind the scenes at the Metropolitan Police.
I was arrested for offering a Know Your Rights legal advice card to a 15-year-old who was being stopped and searched. The officers who were there reacted immediately, incredibly aggressively. They accused me of obstruction. It seemed in almost no time at all they'd grabbed me and were arresting me. I went limp as a form of passive resistance. That was how I found myself in Stoke Newington Police Station.
Dr. Constanza Duff, an assistant professor of philosophy at the University of Nottingham, speaking to The Guardian on Monday, but she's describing there, Theo, an event that happened some time ago. What's the story?
What happened is that in 2013, she was detained after, as you said, she was offering a legal advice card to a teenager who was being stopped and searched in Hackney. She was accused of obstruction and arrested and taken to Stoke Newington Police Station, where they approved a strip search. Now, this has been a very long and complex case, which is only finally sort of beginning to reach some kind of resolution. But basically this week, the Metropolitan Police apologised not for authorising the strip search, but for using sexist, derogatory and unacceptable language while she was being strip searched. And as the part of her very long sort of legal battle, she dug up some CCTV footage which shows the officers discussing what should be done with her. And there are 2 very striking things about it. I mean, the whole case is sort of, there are lots of things about the whole case, but 2 very striking things about this. One is how oppressive the treatment that was being authorized was. They said, treat her like a terrorist, make it clear that resistance is futile. The other thing is the kind of, what she called a peephole into the misogyny, a culture of misogyny, and that you have officers, both male and female, can be heard sort of really sort of medieval stuff, laughing about the hair on her body, saying her clothes smell, her knickers stink, saying whooshy rank. So it's a very disturbing case.
Yes, and also disturbing, Emma, is that the police denied her version of events for many years, even clearing one of the officers of any wrongdoing, which has now obviously been challenged. In a way, what's worse, watching the video? Is it the fact that she was treated in this way in the first place, or is it the fact that there was then some sort of cover-up for years about it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think either of those things reflect very well on the police force at all. I mean, this came from an arrest in 2013, so she's been waiting more than nearly a decade for an apology, and obviously having to, as you say, the Met have dragged it out, tried to deny it, despite obviously this evidence, the CCTV footage being very clear. I think that it certainly raises further questions about attitudes towards women, misogynistic attitudes from the police force, particularly given the events of the last year, taking the Sarah Everard case as an extreme example. It certainly raises yet more questions about the way that officers, particularly in the Metropolitan Police, go about their work in regards to the treatment of women civilians.
And Arion, as she points out, one of the only ways she was able to chase this legally was using crowdfunding, something we'll return to in a story later in the show. But also the fact that she is a middle-class white woman, she teaches at a university. One of the thrusts of her argument is we only know this happened to her because she came forward, because she had the privilege, in inverted commas, to be able to do that. The implication being this is the sort of thing that happens all the time to people, to poorer people, to people of colour, to less able people.
Yes, and there is a great irony in the fact that she had even been trying to hand this young boy, a 15-year-old, who was being arrested, this Know Your Rights card in the first place. It does seem sort of curious that in the act of trying to prevent someone from being arrested in a way that was potentially problematic, she then found herself being subjected to really the worst and most hideous form of arrest that could be possible, even though she had all of the information presumably in her brain about how you can and can't be treated by the police, and even so she went through all of that horror. So I think, it is something that is obviously happening to people with less comprehension about what police powers are than her every day, but it's just there is a terrible irony in the fact that this happened to her even though she knew all of that.
Although I suppose the police may have said, Theo, that it happened to her because she was doing that. She was, intervening on a stop and search that they presumably felt was perfectly legitimate. And then she resisted arrest by going limp and sort of forcing them from their point of view to manhandle her, which is physically exerting, time-consuming. You can see how a stressed police officer would think this person's a troublemaker. I'm not saying any of this makes it right. It evidently doesn't, and that's their decision. But you can see how psychologically they felt about her.
Absolutely. I think, actually in this case, the boy they stopped and searched did have a knife on him. They felt that she was sort of interfering. And I suppose the question is, how you get from that to what happened to her, because the only legal justification for a strip search is if they believe you've got something, an illegal item on your body. Whereas at the time, she was being strip searched because she would refuse to identify herself, which is completely illegal. Now, I don't think any of this has been resolved, so it's still a question of, they said, she said. But it certainly looks quite disturbing from that point of view.
Yeah, so how frequent is strip searching as a technique used by the police across all arrests?
So actually between 2009 and 2014, which were the most recent figures I was able to find, Met officers strip searched just over 134,000 people. And apparently, really sort of disgracefully, more than 4,500 of those people were children as young as 10. So this is something that is going on quite regularly, and with a sort of disturbing undertone of people being, it being done to people of all ages.
And also, I mean, regardless of what the motive is, Emma, it sounds like a sexual assault when you hear her describe it. Tying her up, parting her legs to, quote, look for more piercings because they'd pulled out a piercing from her ear. Even if it's being done sort of legally, it sounds like a horrendous process.
Absolutely, and I mean, the comments being made, Theo mentioned them briefly, but one officer saying, "What's that smell? Oh, it's her knickers." Another officer, the one who conducted the arrest, saying, "Treat her like a terrorist, I don't care." One officer saying that she needs defumigating. What really strikes me is the immense bravery it took from Dr. Duff to pursue this for so many years and to be so public about telling the story of what happened to her. And it raises the question of how many similar incidents will have happened but won't have been spoken about because the people who it happened to would understandably not want to talk about it publicly. As I said before, it reflects extremely badly on the Met Police and on their officers.
To get this far, it's taken an official complaint. Well, first there was the case, which she was accused of assaulting the police officers, and she was cleared. Then there was an official complaint. Then there was an IPCC inquiry. Then there was a judicial review. Then there was a disciplinary process, which cleared the sergeant. Then she launched her crowdfunded civil suit. So 8 years on, she's got an apology. No one's actually been done for misconduct or anything. And you think, if this is what happens to an academic who's clearly very clever and able to, negotiate these things, what's going to happen to other people?
And has an academic interest in the police as well. If she was just training to be a doctor, that would be, she probably wouldn't be bothered to pursue this for so many years.
I think her interest in the police is actually, I think that developed as a result of this case, partly at least.
I mean, the fascinating thing as well is that, even though the Met say that the allegations of misconduct relating to the comments that had been levelled against her have been referred to its Professional Standards Directorate and the investigation is ongoing, Duff herself says, and I think again to her credit, that the individual officers aren't the issue, and she says that the exchanges that she was subjected to, or specifically, the things that were said to her in that vile way, just show that there's this, in her words, culture of sexualized mockery that is broadly apparent within the force in general. And she thinks that it's too easy to single out kind of bad apples and to pin the blame on them, but actually the force needs to look at itself and start to think about how it can reform itself more broadly.
And that phrase, treat her as a terrorist, Theo, is quite revealing, it seems to me. I mean, obviously, the point is everyone deserves to be treated humanely, even if they are a suspected terrorist anyway. But it strikes me that this is sort of someone acknowledging that they're using strip search as an intimidatory tactic. You know someone's done something wrong. We need to rough them up a bit. We can use strip search in that way until we get a thing to charge them with. And that's not supposed to be the point of it, is it?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think it just is, the reason I find this case so interesting is just that it is a really vivid reminder of how oppressive these powers that obviously, I believe the police need, but they are, if not handled very carefully, they become incredibly oppressive very quickly. I think we should remember that this is a police force that is, run by a woman. So, I mean, it's very hard to tell from these sort of cases that exactly how far things go, but and how deep the culture of misogyny goes and who it affects and who it doesn't, because all you get are glimpses. But I think you do have to look at the just the sort of really long running problems about the handling of allegations of male violence against women and the very poor investigations that have been done over so many years. And I think, as Dr. Duff was saying, that there needs to be a proper conversation about this.
I wonder if there's any explanation at all, Arian, that the dehumanising comments that the police are using about her wouldn't have all been overheard by her at the time. Some of them were, but some of them weren't, and they were saying it to each other. And that kind of, yes, it is dehumanising, but that kind of gallows humour is something that we know police officers use and prison officers use because they have to deal with such grim reality.
That's true, except for the fact that Duff says that the things that were caught on CCTV were actually milder than the things that were said to her directly that she wasn't able to dig up evidence of because they hadn't been caught on camera. So, of course, everyone needs to be able to blow off steam. I don't know if this is something that falls into that category because it's so extreme regardless. But I think that what was being said, both behind her back and to her face, was very horrific, in both cases. So I think that that this probably doesn't fall into that sort of, gallows humour category, sadly.
Do you think the Met can turn a corner from this, Emma? I mean, you mentioned the Sarah Everard case. Do you think, at least with this being out in the open, there may be a sense of, OK, well, this is what we've done wrong. This is what we need to change? Possibly.
I mean, it's certainly the only way to sort of get any sort of movement in this is to bring it out in the open, because obviously there's been so many years of, in this case, of going behind the scenes trying to get a resolution through the various pathways that Theo mentioned earlier. But now it's been moved into the public domain, you would hope that there would be more of a reaction. And certainly from the Met Police perspective, it's another blow to their credibility, particularly when it comes to the treatment of women.
Theo, what do you think is going to happen next?
I don't know exactly. I mean, I think at the one extreme, you think, do we need a sort of Macpherson inquiry into misogyny in the police force? At the other end, you think, swept under the carpet?
Certainly, women's rights groups have called for that kind of statutory inquiry specifically into misogyny in the Metropolitan Police. And Anna Burley of Reclaim These Streets said that without this, we risk the Met yet again closing ranks, prioritising their own reputation over women's safety and blaming a handful of named officers rather than the culture that created and protected them. And I think, Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, did launch an inquiry into the Wayne Couzens Sarah Everard case. But critics say that even that is too narrow, that cases like this underscore the fact that there's more going on that needs to be addressed than just individual cases. And it's hard to look at these things as they come up and not see that as legitimate.
Yeah, I suppose that's the real change, isn't it, Theo? Slowly the public get a sense that the few bad apples defence doesn't hold up as much as a conversation about culture.
What seems so shocking to me about this is it just seems so casual, and it seems like just a sort of a normal day. No one's turning around and saying, my goodness, just this is normal life in the police station.
Okay. Emma, you're up next after this. Okay, Emma, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is the NHS failing transgender people?
So what does it mean to you to be able to raise this money to get the surgery?
It will mean an absolute lot. It means that I could probably start preparing for, I suppose, maybe like the next chapter, or moving ahead with the part of my life that I really want to get started and start being more comfortable and just being more happy with both my body and with just being myself.
Eddie Thomas talking to the Worthing Herald on Monday. Emma, who are they and what's the story?
Eddie Thomas is a transgender person who is looking to transition from male to female, but in order to do so is aiming to raise £2,000 towards hormone replacement therapy because of the extremely long wait times on the NHS, which make accessing transgender healthcare for many people in the UK almost impossible.
Yeah, so Eddie says on their crowdfunding page, whilst it is free to medically transition in the UK, the waiting lists for a mere referral can last between 2 to 4 years, and the process to get hormone replacement therapy involves outdated assessments from a panel that predetermines whether or not I'm eligible, and there are no plans to fix the system. Emma, as a trans woman, has that been your experience as well?
Yeah, so basically, full disclosure, this is obviously something that's personal and relevant to me. According to the NHS websites, the maximum waiting time for non-urgent treatments should be 18 weeks from booking date or from when a hospital gets a referral letter. However, at the gender identity clinics, which the NHS runs as providing transgender healthcare, these waiting times are massively outstripped. At the Tavistock and Portman in London, which is where I'm currently registered and currently waiting for appointments, they're currently seeing people referred in November 2017 with an expected appointment date of between 36 to 40 months from the date of the initial referral. So basically the NHS is completely failing to meet its own values and then some.
So the wait that you've had until 2022 for an appointment that you got in 2019, that's not because of COVID, that's your standard wait time?
I mean, it's been slowed down because of COVID, but I was referred to the Tavistock in May 2019, so if I'm lucky, I might get a first appointment this year, and there's no sign of the waiting list shortening, it's only getting longer.
Arion, why do you think that is?
Well, the stats themselves, as Emma was saying, are really quite shocking. More than 13,500 transgender and non-binary adults are currently on waiting lists at gender identity clinics across England. But, to answer your question, in 2014 and to 15, that number was just 3,330. So there's been a huge rise in demand, but there are still just 7 NHS gender identity clinics for adults in England. So I think the problem is that there just isn't the supply to meet the demand, as it were. And I think that that's the thing that first of all needs to be looked at.
And the waiting time for non-urgent surgery is 18 weeks in NHS England, or that's the target anyway, Theo. Why do you think it's so much longer for people at gender identity clinics? It's not just a case of there's a bit more of a wait, is there? You're talking about years longer.
Well, I mean, I think we do have to accept that those figures are being missed all the time and on a massive scale.
People are waiting years for a hip replacement as well, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. The NHS standard in the Constitution is that 92% of people waiting for non-urgent treatment should get it within 18 weeks from their referral to their first treatment. But the last time that was actually met was in February 2016. At the moment, there are 6 million, just under 6 million people now waiting for hospital treatment in Britain, and a lot of them are waiting for a very long time. However, it's quite hard to get a figure for all treatments and, how you do it. It does seem that most people are not waiting nearly as long as that.
But also, Emma, it seems like if it is true that demand has outstripped supply, the supply of knee surgeons and hip surgeons and whatever is very well established over decades of people training in medical school to do that kind of thing. And, if you're talking about, sexual transition surgeons and people who specialise in mental health for gender dysphoria, that is understandably going to be a relatively more recent choice for doctors to have made to work in that field, isn't it? It's existed for 50 years, but it hasn't been so widely spoken about until recently.
I think that it's an issue of whether the gender identity clinics in the NHS are being funded properly, which I don't think within the NHS there's clearly an increased demand for these services, so there should be more funding put in so that the healthcare provided, people are seen and treated effectively for whatever they need, and there just doesn't seem to be the desire to put in this sort of funding into the NHS, which is why so many people are instead having to go private and having to do such as what Eddie is doing and raise money, through crowdfunding or through other means in order to go private. And because the cost of private healthcare for transgender people, for surgery and for the like, is extremely expensive.
Give us an idea of the cost.
One leading clinic in London, the Parkside Clinic, which provides gender-confirming surgery, quotes £15,495 for gender-affirming surgery, genital surgery, plus consultation fee. But it's an incredibly large amount of money, and it's an amount of money that's out of reach for most people. So people are having to go into debt, seek loans, seek crowdfunding in order to get treatment that is available on the NHS, but which is essentially unobtainable.
Yeah, because that's the thing, isn't it, Arion? It's not like actually within the NHS there is any longer a debate about whether it should be available. It should, because that's the decision they've made. There are some people that still treat this like it's a debate about is it cosmetic or not? And it's like, well, that debate has actually been resolved because the NHS do fund it.
Absolutely. I think it's very clear that that this is something that the NHS wants to get involved in. It's just sort of struggling to meet its own targets. And I think that exactly, the things that Emma was talking about there and the story that we heard at the top of this segment from Eddie is there's a big problem that a lot of people end up, because of this deficiency, having to take matters into their own hands. And I read a Guardian article that talked to Samantha Walker, who's been on the waiting list for gender identity services in London for several years. And she said that she knows many trans women in the UK, and almost all of them, she reckoned, had at some point felt the need to self-medicate. There is actually a bridging treatment that the General Medical Council has advised should be offered. So GPs can give hormone treatment before patients attend a gender identity clinic, but it's only available if the individual is suicidal or at risk of self-harming and is already taking medication bought online or elsewhere. And the GP also has to take advice from a gender specialist and prescribe the lowest acceptable dose. So it's both very hard to get and also rather insufficient once it is obtained. So I think that these are problems that really do need to be resolved, and the problem is this wait time.
That said, I suppose, Theo, because trans people are a minority and it's an experience that most people don't have, if you ask the general public, should transitional surgery be prioritised over knee surgery or hip surgery, you can imagine that many people responding to that would say, well, can't you live as the gender you want without surgery? Therefore, it isn't as important as a knee replacement because you can't walk without a knee replacement.
I imagine they would say that, but we have well-established systems and protocols for protecting the interests of minorities in all sorts of areas. And, I think this is an obvious case where more should be done. I mean, it seems to me that the government in general has only sort of really recently started thinking about these things. I mean, it's fascinating that there is no robust official estimate for how many trans people there are in the UK. I mean, so it's quite difficult to predict and provide. And I mean, I noticed that Scotland, for instance, is now spending 9 million to reduce waiting times. Presumably something comparable would be possible in England and Wales as well.
And presumably as well, to factor in, Emma, there's the mental health toll on people that are waiting and waiting and waiting. The date comes and goes.
Absolutely. It's a huge burden on you to know that you can be placed on this waiting list, but then be sort of left for months and months and months, and the only way off is either to stop or to have to pay thousands of pounds. And I mean, you can only say that the NHS's care system for transgender people is only working if you don't believe that trans people should be treated with any form of dignity. It's a constant battle, in order to try and get these bridging treatments, as Arion says. But it's incredibly difficult to be sort of left to your own devices, really. The fact is, these are really life-saving surgeries because, as you mentioned, the mental health toll on transgender people is immense, and it can make you feel as if there is no sort of happy future because of these things being so unobtainable in terms of waiting times, in terms of cost.
Yeah. Okay, Arian, I'm coming to you next after this. Arian, your turn. You're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, Emirati textbooks adopted a new school of thought on Judaism.
This video has been widely circulated on social media. A rabbi in Dubai sounding the shofar, this horn, for the Jewish New Year. An unimaginable sight before agreements between the Arab Emirates and Israel were signed on September the 15th.
France 24 reporting back in November 2020. That was after the Abraham Accords, wasn't it, Arian? With Trump on the lawn at the White House and the UAE and others relaxing their attitude to Israel. What's happened this week?
So this week, school textbooks in the United Arab Emirates have begun promoting the normalization of relations between Arab countries and Israel, according to new research that just recently came out. Though, notably, Israel itself still isn't making its way onto school maps just yet. But the report was by an Israeli group called the Institute for Monitoring Peace and Cultural Tolerance in School Education, Impact SE. That's a fairly narrow brief. But they looked at 220 Arabic language textbooks in UAE schools from grades 1 to 12 and said that they didn't find any examples of anti-Semitism, hate or incitement, and that UNESCO guidelines for peace and tolerance are generally being met, is what they said.
It's a pretty low bar, though, isn't it?
I suppose that does sound low.
No examples of open hatred
right.
or incitement to violence. But Israel still isn't on the map. So, I mean, how significant a change is this?
Yes, and some of the school textbooks would sort of put a blank where Israel currently sits, and, you know, there's the implication that there's a country there without actually spelling out what that country is. But even though this does all maybe sound a bit minor, this report coincides with a really interesting feature that was in The Economist this week about how the Arab world is re-embracing its Jews, and specifically that after years of practical exclusion following the establishment of Israel, Jews are now beginning to be welcomed back across the region, as we heard in that clip at the top of this segment.
And Theo, I know you grew up partly in the UAE, didn't you? Would this have been unimaginable in your youth?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a thing by Bernard Lewis, the historian, saying that by the 80s, he said that classical anti-Semitism had become an essential part of Arab intellectual life. It also was very much part of ordinary life. That it was just unbelievable compared to today's world. The sort of casual hatred and demonization that was just part of absolutely the fabric of everything that happened in the Arab world.
So what do you think's changed hearts and minds here, Theo? Because they haven't just decided it would be a good thing not to be anti-Semitic, have they?
Well, it's a wonderful act of diplomacy by President Trump. You know, it is actually quite a great achievement, but there are all sorts of complicated things in the background, such as Saudi and the UAE wanting to, been forming long-term alliances with Israel against Iran, because they regard them as a threat. There's also the fact that most of the Arab world has sort of given up on the idea of there ever being a settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian issue, which is rather a sad reason why things are going better at the moment. I thought the Economist had a good point, saying that the failures and excesses of Arab nationalism and Islamism have forced many countries to rethink chauvinist dogmas, because both of those have come to a dead end, and particularly you think the Arab Spring and how bad it all went. I imagine that the sort of the upside to that is people are probably a bit more open to rethinking these things.
And also, more crudely, Emma, they need some tourist dollars, don't they? They're moving away, these countries, from their dependence on oil. Americans, a lot of them, Jewish and not, probably don't feel comfortable going to the UAE because of this history of anti-Semitism, and they want to be open to everybody. Saudi Arabia wants people to go to Neom when they build it. Absolutely.
I suppose at one level it is a encouraging sort of call for tolerance, but I think it is certainly a pragmatic move as well. But you could argue that sort of diplomacy is often, and diplomatic success is often based off pragmatism, and it doesn't really matter how you get to this more tolerant position as long as it's reached.
I mean, it genuinely does seem to indicate, doesn't it, as a tourist from Britain, that if you went to a city like Dubai or Abu Dhabi on holiday, that you would be more likely to be welcomed from the West.
Exactly. It's hardly a ringing call for peace, and the issues clearly remain in regards to Israel, but it is a step forwards. And I mean, the fact that these are in school textbooks, so it's children being encouraged to be more tolerant, which is encouraging for the future, and it's putting more tolerant attitudes within the minds of young people, which can only be seen as a good thing.
Well, yes, except that takes years to bear fruit, doesn't it, Arian? And it's one thing to say, oh, look, a rabbi can blow a shofar from a balcony in a hotel in Dubai. It's another thing, isn't it, to have, a normal, common and everyday practicing Jew walking around openly in the market in Riyadh and how they might be treated.
Yes, definitely. And if you think about the impact of the many decades of casual anti-Semitism of the sort that Theo was talking about that he experienced when he was growing up in the Arab world, if you think about the UAE itself, much of its curriculum had been written by people with Islamist leanings, and in the 60s and 70s, the UAE welcomed thousands of foreigners in the way that Dubai still does today, and other parts of the UAE as well. Most of them then came from Egypt, though, and they'd arrived to fill the UAE's need for educated professionals and bureaucrats. And according to the Emirati journalist Sultan Al-Qasemi, by the 1990s, Islamists had come to dominate the education and judicial ministries in particular. And I saw this interesting report in the New York Times that said that textbooks became riddled with casual anti-Semitism throughout, even in subjects like history and maths, where you might encounter questions like, if you kill 3 Jewish settlers and spare 2, what's the sum? Which is, just a shocking sort of thing that is now having to be undone through all of those years. And even if, as Emma says, it is possible to do so through school textbooks by reaching the next generation, certainly previous generations will have already gone through a system with that sort of thing in the back of their mind. So, it's promising, but there's a lot to be done here.
How do you think the Palestinians feel about this, Theo?
Well, they feel very betrayed as well. They might, I suppose, in the sense that it was the sort of defining cause for the Arab world for so many years, and now it just isn't anymore. And we've got about a third of Arab countries now, in one form or another, have formal relations with Israel. So that's changing. I suppose it probably puts the possibility of any kind of resolution, remote as it was, even further back.
It will take generations as well, won't it, for the Jews that were effectively expelled from those Arabic countries in protest against Israel's treatment of the Palestinian people, well, I suppose in protest against the establishment of Israel at all, to feel genuinely welcomed back, though. And if you left Morocco or you left Egypt and you went to live in Israel because you had no choice, you're not going to think, great, they've changed their mind, I'm coming straight back.
Yeah, it's such a large number of people. Let's forget how there were more Jews in Arab countries outside of Israel than there were inside. There was about 900,000 people across North Africa, Egypt, Iraq, Yemen, Lebanon, and then finally Iran. I mean, I think that certainly with a lot of Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews, they do feel, obviously they have very deep and abiding links to the area.
They might feel more Iraqi than they do Israeli.
Easily, yeah. And I know among people I've known that whose families came from Iraq, they've always had an abiding kind of interest about going back, or at least going back to visit. And so I think, those ties are still there. So I suppose in a sort of optimistic way, you sort of think, well, they could rediscover them in a kinder environment.
But I think your point is a fair one, Ollie, that, it is one thing for some Arab universities to be opening up departments in Jewish history and for more sympathetic portrayals of Jews to be appearing in Arab films and TV shows as they are, and also for, as the Economist report mentioned, the Egyptian government to be renovating Jewish cemeteries and all of these sort of positive changes. There's a big difference between that and people actually feeling like they are safe to pick up their family and take them to these countries, which they may have long historical ties to. But, it's a big ask to uproot your entire life and hope that you're going to have the kind of safety that it looks like it may be on the horizon. But I don't think you could be confident of that just yet.
And fascinatingly, from your world, Emma, some joint Arab-Israeli bids for sporting events as well.
Yes, there's a possible bid from Israel along with other nations for the 2030 World Cup, which would be quite extraordinary. I suppose it indicates potentially a future positive relationships with other nations in the region. I mean, in these textbooks, you have Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Iraq being presented as important UAE allies, but also regional rivals such as Turkey and Qatar being presented in these textbooks without being directly criticised. It seems to be an indication of a potential softening across the board in terms of the negative relations between these countries.
Well, at least if the Economist feature is anything to go by, there is some hope. And it says that if you look at the trajectory of Morocco, for example, the improvement of relations there shows some sign of endurance. And, the kingdom began reconnecting decades ago, and now Jews of Moroccan origin are able to reclaim their citizenship. And they spoke to and gave the final word to Avraham Moyal, who's a rabbi of Moroccan descent who's moved back to Morocco. And he said, "We've smashed the taboo." And I just thought that was a nice way to summarize at least the potential for how these things go. The taboo has been broken. Now we just have to see if it will last.
Okay. Put your textbooks down. Joint top of the class merits to Theo, Emma and Arion. Remember, you can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts. And if you found us today via a Spotify playlist, then tap Go to Podcast and then tap Follow now. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to Unwrap next week, bye-bye.